Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It happened one quiet evening, the kind where the world feels smaller, softer somehow. The sky was a faded blue, slipping into the kind of darkness that carries no rush, no drama, just stillness. I had spent the whole day cleaning the house, half lost in my thoughts, and by the time I realized I hadn't eaten dinner, it was already past 9. I didn't expect anyone to knock at that hour. But then there was that soft, polite knock, the kind that almost apologizes before it happens. When I opened the door, there stood my neighbor, Daniel. He was holding a small basket of apples, said his sister had brought too many from her farm upstate. Daniel had lived next door for about 3 years. We waved in the mornings, exchanged quick "how are you" conversations at the mailbox, but that was about it. Still, there was always something calm about him, something steady, the sort of presence that doesn't demand space but quietly fills it anyway. That I invited him in, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the quiet of the evening, or maybe it was the loneliness that sometimes creeps in when the house is too tidy, too silent. He hesitated, then smiled, and said he wouldn't stay long. But of course, that wasn't how the night went. We sat in the kitchen, because somehow, the kitchen always feels safer than the living room, less formal, more real. I put the kettle on, and while the water boiled, he looked around and said softly, "You keep your kitchen like a storybook." I laughed at that, though I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation. My kitchen wasn't fancy. The table was old, a little uneven on one side, and the curtains had faded sun spots from years of morning light. But it felt alive. We started with small talk. The weather, his sister's apple trees, the neighborhood dogs that bark too much. Then, as often happens when two people stop trying to fill silence, the conversation deepened. He asked if I lived here alone. I told him yes, for almost 10 years now. My husband had passed away, quietly, suddenly, and since then, the house had been mine alone. I hadn't said those words out loud in a while. They came out steadier than I expected. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just nodded, like he understood something he'd never say aloud. Then, after a pause, he told me about his own story, how his marriage ended not in anger, but in distance. Two people who grew kind, but apart. There was something deeply human in the way he spoke. No bitterness. No pity. Just truth, raw and simple. The kettle whistled. I poured the tea, and the sound of it filled the air between us. He took a sip, looked at the steam rising, and said, "You know, it's strange how people can live side by side for years and barely know each other." I smiled and said, "Maybe we wait until we're ready to be known." He looked up, and for a brief moment, I felt that gentle ache, not of attraction, but of understanding. The kind of connection that feels like a mirror being held up to your quiet places. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Outside, the wind brushed through the dry autumn leaves. Inside, we shared little pieces of our lives, things that usually stay tucked away. He told me about his father's workshop, the smell of sawdust, the lessons in patience. I told him about my garden, how every spring I planted tulips in memory of my mother, even though the deer always ate half of them. He laughed at that, a warm, genuine laugh that filled the room. And I found myself laughing too. It felt strange at first, but also good, like a window being opened after a long winter. At one point, I noticed the light above the stove flickering, casting soft shadows across his face. There was a calmness there, one that comes from living through enough to stop pretending. I realized how rare it is to sit with someone who listens without waiting to speak. The hours slipped by unnoticed. When I glanced at the clock again, it was almost midnight. He followed my gaze and smiled, saying, "I didn't mean to take up your whole evening." "You didn't," I replied. "You made it better." We both stood, and for a second, neither of us knew how to end the moment. The air held that quiet hesitation, not awkward, but tender. He reached for his jacket, then stopped, looking at the half-empty teacups on the table. "Maybe next time," he said softly, "I'll bring coffee instead." I smiled. "Maybe next time, I'll bake something to go with it." He nodded, his eyes gentle but steady. Then he left, and the house fell silent again, but a different kind of silence. Not empty, not heavy. Just full, like a song that had finally found its melody. That night, as I rinsed the cups and set them on the counter to dry, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked softer, somehow. Less tired. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the tea, or maybe it was the conversation, the rare kind that touches the quiet corners of the soul without trying to fix them. I went to bed with that thought, that maybe connection doesn't always need grand beginnings. Sometimes, it starts in a kitchen, over a cup of tea, with two people who simply decide to stay a little longer than they planned. And though he left that night, something lingered, a quiet warmth that filled the space he'd just been in. I didn't know it then, but that simple evening would unfold into something deeper in the days to come, something that would remind me that even after years of solitude, life still knows how to surprise you. The next time Daniel came over, it wasn't planned. I was in the middle of chopping vegetables for a simple dinner when I heard a knock. I hesitated for just a second, not because I didn't want him here, but because it had been one of those long, quiet days where the silence inside your own home makes you question whether anyone would really understand it. But of course, it was him, standing there with that familiar, easy smile and a bag of freshly baked bread from his morning bakery visit. "Thought you might need this," he said softly, holding out the bag like an offering, a gesture that somehow felt both simple and profound. I invited him in without thinking, and we ended up in the kitchen again. The table was still cluttered from my earlier attempts at dinner, but he didn't seem to mind. He pulled up a chair, and I noticed how the light from the kitchen window fell across his face, highlighting the soft lines that spoke of experience, quiet laughter, and years lived fully. There's something about the way light hits someone at the right moment. It feels like seeing them in a way you didn't notice before. We started with small talk again, but the atmosphere was different this time. There was no pretense, no effort to impress. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the faint clink of utensils, and the comfort of being in someone's company without the need to perform. I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud, about my mother's illness, about the fears I kept tucked away, about the loneliness that sometimes feels too heavy even for a house full of memories. He listened. Not just the polite nods and murmurs people give when they're thinking of what to say next, but really listened. And then he shared parts of his life too, stories of missed opportunities, quiet regrets, moments of unexpected joy. There was no pity, no judgment, just a shared humanity that felt grounding. As the evening stretched on, the conversation wove through light and heavy moments effortlessly. I told him about the garden, about planting tulips in memory of my mother, and how sometimes the deer would eat half of them, leaving only the stubborn blooms standing. He laughed softly at that, shaking his head like he could picture the scene perfectly, and then he told me about a tree in his backyard that refused to grow straight, twisting stubbornly toward the sun despite the odds. It struck me how similar our stories were, not identical, of course, but echoes of patience, of resilience, of small victories that often go unnoticed. The tea was forgotten this time, left steaming in the cups, as the night seemed to deepen around us. Shadows played across the walls, stretching and shrinking with the dim kitchen light. There was a moment when he paused, looking around the room as if he could feel the weight of my life in the small objects around us, the framed photos, the chipped mugs, the knife marks on the cutting board. "There's something comforting here," he said softly. "Like every part of this house has a memory it's holding on to." I nodded, my throat tight in a way I couldn't explain. "I think that's why it's hard to leave sometimes," I whispered. We sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that belongs only to people who have begun to understand each other, the quiet spaces between words that carry meaning without explanation. Then, without planning it, we began to share small habits, the little things that make us who we are. I told him about my morning routine of watering the plants and reading the newspaper on the porch. He told me about his Sunday walks to the bakery and how he always pauses to watch an old man feed pigeons in the park. Every detail mattered. Every story stitched the invisible thread between us a little tighter. By the time he left that night, it felt different than the first visit. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the room felt warmer, as if our presence had rearranged the air itself. I washed the dishes slowly, thinking about the way he had smiled at the story of my tulips, about the quiet nods that had made me feel seen in a way that was rare and precious. As I locked the door behind him, I realized that something subtle had shifted. I felt lighter, more aware of the quiet joys in my life. It wasn't the kind of change that could be measured or seen from the outside, but it was unmistakable. A warmth had entered the space between us, a gentle thread that promised that connection doesn't need grand gestures, it can grow in the soft corners of everyday life, over shared stories and unhurried tea. That night, I didn't just sleep, I lingered in thought, replaying snippets of our conversation, marveling at how rare it is to meet someone who listens without trying to fix, someone who simply honors the story you're willing to tell. And somewhere deep inside, I realized that this quiet companionship, these small, meaningful evenings, was something I hadn't known I'd been waiting for, yet couldn't imagine my days without. It was a weekend afternoon when Daniel came over again, this time without knocking. I had left the door slightly ajar, expecting the mailman, but when I noticed him stepping inside, I didn't feel surprised, only glad. There was a sense of rhythm to his visits now, a quiet expectation that something meaningful awaited us in those hours we spent in my kitchen. The sunlight poured through the window, warm and forgiving, casting a golden glow over the small table where we would inevitably end up. He carried a small pot of honey from his neighbor's apiary and placed it on the table with a casual reverence, like it was more than just food, it was a gift, a gesture of thoughtfulness that felt rare these days. We settled into our usual seats, and for a few moments, neither of us spoke. I watched him as he opened the pot carefully, the scent of wildflowers filling the room. I realized again how easy it was to forget the passage of time when he was near. Each movement, each quiet glance, seemed to slow the world down around us. The conversation started gently, as it always did, with stories about neighbors, stray cats, and the curious patterns of weather. But soon, it drifted toward the quieter corners of life, the ones we often avoid because they make us vulnerable. I've been thinking a lot about choices lately, Daniel said, looking at his hands as if he were reading a story written in his own skin. Not just the big ones, but the little ones. How they add up, and sometimes, they change everything without us even noticing. I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words settle over me. It's strange, I admitted. How life keeps moving, whether we're paying attention or not. And then one day, you realize that the person you've become is nothing like the person you were hoping to be. He smiled faintly, a mixture of understanding and empathy that seemed to wrap around me like a soft blanket. I think that's what makes these quiet moments so important, he said. They remind us that even when life feels messy or incomplete, there's beauty in the way we keep going, in how we notice the small things, the tiny connections that make it all worth it. I looked at him then, really looked, and felt a stirring of something I hadn't expected. Not romantic, not urgent, just a recognition of the depth of understanding in someone who had listened to my stories and shared his own without judgment. The afternoon drifted on. We poured tea, sampled the honey on thick slices of bread, and laughed at small absurdities, a story about his neighbor's runaway dog, my own failed attempt to grow tomatoes on the windowsill. The kitchen felt alive with the comfort of companionship, the kind that doesn't demand, doesn't rush, and yet leaves a lasting impression on the soul. At some point, the light shifted, turning from gold to the soft peach of late afternoon, and our conversation grew more reflective. He told me about a childhood memory, a quiet river he used to visit, the way the water shimmered in the sun, the way the birds seemed to whisper secrets if you listened carefully. I shared my own memory, of sitting on the porch of my childhood home, watching my mother knit in the fading light, feeling a sense of security that I hadn't realized I'd carried into adulthood. There was a pause then, long enough that it almost seemed uncomfortable, but it wasn't. It was the kind of pause that exists between two people who trust each other enough to be silent together. I feel like I've known you longer than I actually have, he said finally, his voice low, almost contemplative. I know, I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what I meant. It wasn't just familiarity, it was connection. It was a recognition of shared human experience, of the quiet understanding that sometimes, people enter your life and simply make it more bearable, more meaningful. The sun finally dipped behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the kitchen floor. Daniel stood to leave, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to break the spell of the afternoon. Same time next weekend? I asked, almost tentatively, as if asking might break the fragile balance we'd found. He nodded, smiling softly. I wouldn't miss it. As he stepped out, the door closing gently behind him, I felt a rare sense of fullness. It wasn't about companionship in the ordinary sense, it was something deeper, a quiet understanding that life had given me a gift I hadn't expected. A gift that had nothing to do with urgency or excitement, and everything to do with presence, with being truly seen and heard. I stood by the window, looking at the fading light, and realized that these moments, simple, quiet, shared, were slowly changing me. They were reminding me that even in solitude, there is warmth to be found, and that the smallest gestures, a loaf of bread, a pot of honey, a few hours of genuine conversation, can leave a mark that lingers for years. The next time Daniel came over, it was nearly evening. The sky outside was brushed with the soft lavender and pinks of sunset, and the air had that gentle chill that signals autumn is truly here. I was stirring a pot of soup, the aroma of garlic and rosemary filling the kitchen, when he stepped in quietly, carrying a small bundle of fresh herbs tied with string. He handed them to me with that same soft, thoughtful smile, and I realized again how his gestures always felt like tiny threads weaving connection into the ordinary fabric of life. We settled at the table as we had so many times before, but the energy in the room was different. There was a familiarity now, a rhythm that had grown between us over these past few visits. No need for small talk or awkward introductions, we simply shared space and allowed the conversation to flow naturally. "I noticed your tulips are still holding up," he said, gesturing toward the small plant on the windowsill. "Even after the deer." I laughed softly, nodding. "They're stubborn, just like me. Somehow, they survive." He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt that quiet recognition again, the kind that doesn't need words. There was respect in his eyes, a gentle acknowledgement of the struggles, the resilience, the small victories that often go unseen. We talked about our weeks, the subtle ups and downs that make life textured. He spoke of a neighbor's illness, of little triumphs at work, of the slow joy of finding a forgotten book in a dusty corner. I shared my own stories, the way the garden was finally blooming after weeks of tending, the letters I wrote but never sent, the small, private moments that felt significant only because they were mine. Then, as the sun dipped lower, the conversation deepened in a way that surprised me. Daniel spoke about his regrets, not as confessions but as observations. He reflected on choices made, roads not taken, moments where life shifted subtly and irrevocably. I shared my own reflections, about missed opportunities, about loss, and about the strange, comforting knowledge that life, even when hard, has a way of giving you what you need in quiet, unexpected doses. The kitchen became a sanctuary of sorts. The light shifted from warm amber to the soft glow of the overhead lamp. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving with the evening. There was no rush, no expectation, just presence, mutual respect, and the kind of understanding that feels like it could last longer than any single conversation. We laughed together at small, everyday absurdities. A burnt soup crust I tried to scrape off, a story about his cat stealing bread, the tiny disasters that make ordinary life memorable. And then, in a quieter moment, he paused, looking at me with an intensity that wasn't intrusive but deeply attentive. "I'm glad we met," he said simply. "Not everyone finds someone who can sit quietly, who listens, really listens. It's rare." I felt a warmth rise in my chest. "It is rare," I agreed. And I don't think I realized how much I needed it until now. We sat for a while longer, sipping tea that had long since cooled, letting the silence stretch comfortably between words. It was in these unhurried moments that I understood the truth of connection, that it doesn't always arrive with fanfare or urgency. Sometimes, it seeps in quietly, through shared stories, laughter, and the willingness to simply be present with another person. When he finally rose to leave, the night fully upon us, I realized how deeply these visits had touched me. It wasn't just companionship, and it wasn't just friendship. It was the recognition that someone had seen me, my stories, my laughter, my quiet moments, and honored them without judgment, without expectation. As he walked down the steps and disappeared into the night, I lingered by the window, looking at the fading glow of the sky. The kitchen was quiet, but it was filled with something intangible, a lingering warmth, the echo of conversations that had subtly changed me. I realized that the house no longer felt quite so empty, that even in solitude, life had a way of bringing unexpected, meaningful connections into your world. That I stood there for a long time, thinking about how rare it is to find someone who honors your story, who listens deeply, and how life, even in its ordinary rhythm, can surprise you with moments that linger far longer than the hours themselves. The memory of that evening stayed with me, a quiet, luminous moment in a life otherwise filled with routine. And I knew that even years from now, when the kitchen smelled of herbs and tea, when the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the floor, I would remember this, the gentle, profound gift of connection, shared simply, fully, and without expectation. And in that reflection, I understood something essential: that the heart of life isn't always in grand gestures or dramatic events, but in these small, intimate moments where two people meet, listen, and quietly change each other's world.